Imperial Valley Press, July 2nd, 1937. Earhart missing at sea. Fuel supply exhausted over ocean. Nowhere to ship in more than 5 hours. Howland Island, Oceania, July 2nd UP. The Coast Guard cutter Itasca. Failing to hear from Amelia Earhart, en route here from Leah, New Guinea, on a round-the-world flight. Began preparations at 2 p.m. PST to leave the island to search for her. The last definite word received from Miss Earhart's $80,000 twin-motored Lockheed Electra was at 9:16 a.m. when message from Kraft said it was progressing satisfactorily and that it hoped its gas supply would be sufficient. The last cryptic message from Miss Earhart indicated her plane had but 30 minutes fuel supply left. This was more than 5 hours ago, indicating she may have been forced down at sea. The position report the 39-year-old flyer gave at that time indicated she might be within several hundred miles of her goal, this tiny pinpoint of sand and coral in the mid-Pacific just north of the equator. Miss Earhart reported all was well at the time. Then silence enveloped her daring effort to blaze a new aviation trial, covering 2,550 miles between Lae, New Guinea, and Howland. San Francisco, July 2nd, UP. Silence this afternoon developed progress of Amelia Earhart as she raced across the Pacific toward Howland Island, tiny speck in the South Seas, on the most dangerous lap of her round-the-world flight. Miss Earhart and her navigator, Captain Fred Noonan, flying a single-motored Lockheed Electra, failed to reach Howland Island at noon PST. Their tentatively scheduled arrival time were 18 hours after their takeoff from Lae, New Guinea, 2,550 miles away. The last definite report of the plane was made at 6:18 a.m. PST by the Coast Guard cutter Itasca at Howland. At that hour, the Itasca radioed that signals from Miss Earhart's plane were coming in. George Putnam, husband of Miss Earhart, refused to be alarmed. She might have slowed up for any number of causes, he said. She'll make it all right.
The Bismarck Tribune, July 3rd, 1937. Amelia lost in Pacific South Seas. Globe girdlers lost in shark-infested seas. Somewhere near Howland Island on the map, center right above, the plane, top, of Amelia Earhart, center left, is believed to float. The famed aviatrix missed her destination on a flight from New Guinea. With her is Captain Fred Noonan, inset map right, who had piloted her on a round-the-world flight that began at Miami June 1st, as shown on the map below. Aviatrix misses Howland Islet on hazardous flight. By sea and air, mighty hunt is launched to find monoplane believed floating somewhere in shark-infested waters. Adverse winds and static caused speed and radio troubles from time ship left New Guinea, no land for hundreds of miles. By the Associated Press. Reports that the voice of tousle-haired Amelia Earhart had been picked up, calling SOS from the mystery spot where she is lost in mid-Pacific, buoyed hope Saturday for her ultimate rescue as the U.S. Navy ordered a battleship into the search. Two Los Angeles amateur radio operators as late as 7 a.m. Pacific Time 9 a.m. CST said they distinctly heard her sound her call letters, KHAQQ, after thrice saying SOS some 20 minutes earlier. At San Francisco, however, a Coast Guard station reported at 11 a.m. CST it had received no word whatever, although radio reception was unusually good. Earlier, the Los Angeles operators, Walter McMenemy and Carl Pearson, interpreted radio signals as placing the plane adrift near the equator between Gilbert Islands and Howland Island. The latter Miss Earhart's destination when her fuel was exhausted more than 20 hours before. At Washington, the Navy Department ordered the battleship Colorado, with 3 planes aboard, to begin a search from Honolulu, where it arrived Friday. I recognized Miss Earhart's voice from conversations I've had with her, although I never heard her on the air before, said Pearson concerning his 7 a.m. reception. Walter recognized her because he maintained wireless contact with her plane on her flight from Oakland to Hawaii this spring. Their reports were added to an increasing number of others, all believed coming from the missing plane and prompting Coast Guardsmen to express belief Miss Earhart and her navigator would be rescued. The operators said that in between Miss Earhart's code and voice signals they could hear her carrier wave, a steady whistle from which her location could be determined by means of a radio compass. As searchers took hope from their knowledge that Miss Earhart and her companion carried a rubber raft intended to keep them afloat, The Weather Bureau at Washington reported clouds and some wind near Howland Island. KHAQQ is the call of Miss Earhart's plane, last heard from in the air Friday at 1:12 p.m. CST, when she reported she and her navigator, the veteran Fred Noonan, could not sight land and were nearly out of gas. Another message signed with the plane's call letters and seeking radio contact was picked up in the South Seas earlier by the New Zealand warship Achilles, the San Francisco Coast Guard reported. Miss Earhart was generally believed to have come down in shark-infested waters within a radius of 100 miles northwest of Howland Island after having overshot the tiny target on a 2,570-mile hop from La, New Guinea. A heavy smoke belched from the funnels of the cutter Itasca, visible for 9 miles from its Howland Island anchorage, as it plowed forward on a smooth sea in quest of the $80,000 Earhart, flying laboratory. Hunt by sea and air, while the cutter hunted by sea the woman who started a world flight, just for fun. A Navy flying boat sped over the 1,500-mile distance from Honolulu. Former Forks boy is stationed on island. Grand Forks, North Dakota, July 3, AP. Richard B. Black, former Grand Forks boy and a graduate of the University of North Dakota, is in charge of the United States government station at Howland Island. Since the United States took possession of the island 2 years ago, it has been used as a station for making meteorological observations. Control of the island was transferred to the Interior Department in May, and Black was placed in charge of constructing runways for a South Pacific air base. Black was a member of the Byrd expedition to the Antarctic in 1933. He left Grand Forks in 1936 and was sent from Hawaii to Howland Island. The Navy minesweeper Swan joined the hunt from a position halfway between Honolulu and Howland, where it had been stationed to give any possible aid to Miss Earhart on the next leg of her flight. The flying boat itself undertook a hazardous night flight to join the search. Carrying a crew of 8, it took off from Pearl Harbor and headed directly for the of land which the veteran aviatrix and her navigator missed. Lieutenant W. W. Harvey, piloting the plane, was expected to reach the searching area in about 13 hours. Itasca scours waters. Throughout the night, the Itasca, stationed at Howland originally to assist the aviatrix and Noonan, scoured the waters within a 100-mile radius of the island, watching for distress flares. At Los Angeles, Mrs. E.S. Earhart, her stepmother, said resolutely, "I am sure Amelia will come through." Paul Mance, technical advisor to the aviatrix who twice crossed the Atlantic, said in Burbank, California, the plane's 6 gas tanks would give it buoyancy to stay afloat indefinitely. George Palmer Putnam, husband of the missing flyer, was in constant communication with Coast Guard headquarters at San Francisco. He expressed belief his wife and her companion would be found safe. Plane had lifeboat. The plane had a 2-man rubber lifeboat, life belts, flares, a signal, continued on page 3.
The Evening Star, July 3, 1937. Miss Earhart's voice heard in SOS spurs searchers for plane. Amateurs pick up signals at 10 a.m. Ships, flyers rush to scene. Aviatrix is down 100 miles from Howland. Background: Amelia Earhart began present attempt to circle globe at equator because she longed for new worlds to conquer. No one had traveled around the Earth's waistline. It was not her first record hop. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic and the first person, man or woman, twice to fly the ocean. Among her many other first flights was her solo from Honolulu to California in 1935. By the Associated Press, Honolulu, July 3rd, reports that the voice of tousle-haired Amelia Earhart had been picked up calling SOS from the mystery spot where she is lost in mid-Pacific, buoyed hopes for her ultimate rescue today as the United States Navy ordered a battleship into the search. 2 Los Angeles amateur radio operators as late as 7 a.m. Pacific Time, 10 a.m. EST, said they distinctly heard her sound her call letters, KHAQQ, after thrice saying SOS some 20 minutes earlier. At San Francisco, however, a Coast Guard station reported at noon Eastern Standard Time it had received no word whatever, although radio reception was unusually good. Earlier, the Los Angeles operators Walter McMenemy and Carl Pearson interpreted radio signals as placing the plane adrift near the equator between Gilbert Islands and Howland Island. The latter Miss Earhart's destination when her fuel was exhausted more than 20 hours before. Battleship ordered a search. At Washington, the Navy Department ordered the battleship Colorado, with 3 planes aboard, to begin a search from Honolulu, where it arrived yesterday. I recognized Miss Earhart's voice from conversations I have had with her, although I never heard her on the air before, said Pearson concerning his 7 a.m. reception. Walter recognized her because he maintained wireless contact with her plane on her flight from Oakland to Hawaii this spring. Their efforts were added to an increasing number of others, all believed coming from the missing plane, and prompting Coast Guardsmen to express belief that Miss Earhart and her navigator would be rescued. KHAQQ is the call of Miss Earhart's plane, last heard from in the air yesterday at 2:12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when she reported she and her navigator, the veteran Fred Noonan, could not sight land and were nearly out of gas. Another message signed with the plane's call letters and seeking radio contact was picked up in the South Seas earlier by the New Zealand warship Achilles, the San Francisco Coast Guard reported. The Achilles, many miles south and east of Howland, messaged, "Unknown station heard to make. Please give us a few flashes if you get us. 7 signal on 3.105 kilocycles." This station made KHAQQ twice and disappeared. Nothing more since then. The Achilles message said the radio was heard on 3.105 kilocycles in shark-infested waters. Miss Earhart was generally believed to have come down in shark-infested waters within a radius of 100 miles northwest of Howland Island after having overshot the tiny target on a 2,570-mile hop from La, New Guinea. Coast Guardsmen suggested the flyers may have reached a mid-Pacific coral reef or sandspit and set up their emergency radio on land. Weather conditions were reported fairly favorable for safety of the pair, whether they were on a remote atoll or adrift. A heavy smoke belched from the funnels of the gleaming white, 250-foot cutter Itasca, visible for 9 miles from its Howland Island anchorage, as it plowed forward on a smooth sea in quest of the $80,000 Earhart flying laboratory. While the cutter hunted by sea, a Navy flying boat sped over the 1,500-mile distance from Honolulu. The Navy minesweeper Swan joined the hunt from a position halfway between here and Howland, where it had been stationed to give any possible aid to Miss Earhart on the next leg of her flight. The flying boat itself undertook a hazardous night flight to join the search. Carrying a crew of 8, it took off from Pearl Harbor and headed See Earhart, page A3. Amelia Earhart, as she greeted Brazilians after landing in Fortaleza. This is one of the last photographs of the aviatrix. Lieutenant W.W. Harvey, flyer who hopped off last night from Honolulu to search for the world flyers. Map of the Pacific region for hundreds of miles around the lonely and tiny Howland Island where Miss Earhart intended to stop on her projected route, dotted line from La, New Guinea to Honolulu. The search for Miss Earhart and Fred Noonan and their plane presumably is centering in the open water above and to the left of Howland, in approximately the spot denoted by the cross. Some of these specks are scarcely more than sandbars or coral reefs, and most of them are uninhabited and off Pacific ship lanes. Preparations for Howland hop told in Miss Earhart's story. The following dispatch from Amelia Earhart, the last personal story received from her before she was reported missing, was filed before she departed from La and was received last night. By Amelia Earhart, by wireless to the Star. La, New Guinea, July 1st. Denmark's a prison, and La, attractive and unusual as it is, appears to 2 flyers just as confining as the Lockheed Electra is poised for our longest hop, the 2,556 miles to Howland Island in mid-Pacific. The monoplane is weighted with gasoline and oil to capacity. However, a wind blowing the wrong way and threatening clouds conspired to keep her on the ground today. In addition, Captain Fred Noonan, my navigator, has been unable, because of radio difficulties, to set his chronometers. Any lack of knowledge of their fastness and slowness would defeat the accuracy of celestial navigation. Howland is such a small spot in the Pacific that every aid to locating it must be available. Fred Noonan and I have worked, see preparation, page A3.
Washington Times, July 3, 1937. Hope held for Miss Earhart as radio calls are picked up. All world praying for her. Amelia Earhart Putnam, America's aviatrix #1, who awaits rescue in the mid-Pacific with her navigator, Captain Fred J. Noonan. Forced down by exhaustion of fuel on their hop to lonely Howland Island, the two have been sending out SOS calls picked up by ships and stations ashore. This picture of Mrs. Putnam was made at Carapito, Venezuela, one of the stops on her flight around the world. International News Photo. Putnam and wife of navigator keep vigil. Oakland, California, July 3, INS. A man and woman kept a tense vigil at the radio station at Oakland Airport throughout the night and the early morning today. They were George Palmer Putnam, husband of Amelia Earhart, and Mrs. Frederick Noonan, bride of Miss Earhart's veteran navigator. Informed that radio signals had been picked up from the round-the-world plane, forced down in, continued on page 2, column 2. U.S. Navy craft rushed to aid of drifting plane. San Francisco, July 3, INS. Faint, staccato SOS signals streaking across the Pacific today spurred hope that Amelia Earhart and her globe-girdling companion, Captain Fred Noonan, down by fuel exhaustion, would be saved. As dawn broke over the vast, uncharted area near the tiny islet of Howland, a naval flying boat joined the Coast Guard cutter Itasca in scouring the shark-infested waters for the flyers. Search was intensified after a British warship reported a hopeful message from the drifting plane, and amateur radio operators in Los Angeles reported picking up faint SOS flashes and the call letters of Miss Earhart's radio. The distress signals, crackling through the early morning hours, gradually fading in dense static interference, were merely SOS, KHAQQ, SOS, KHAQQ. KHAQQ are the call letters of Miss Earhart's famed $80,000 flying laboratory. Long hours of dread silence, which jealously guarded the fate of the famed aviatrix and her navigator, were shattered just before midnight when a British man-of-war reported receiving a message from the drifting plane. Down but radio working, was the message flashed from the plane. Give us a few dots and dashes if you get us, the message added. The British man-of-war Achilles, 600 miles south of the equator near Solomon Islands, flashed the message to the mainland, via Honolulu. The Achilles reported it picked up the message at 11:28 p.m. PST, faint signals heard. The Fort Shafter Army radio station at Honolulu reported it heard faint signals at the same hour and believed they were from Miss Earhart's plane. The Coast Guard station at Honolulu reported hearing Miss Earhart's carrier wave faintly, but no signals. The signals were reported on the frequency of 62.10, on which no other stations operate. Searchers believe that the aviatrix may have succeeded in mooring the plane safely to one of the tiny unnamed coral atolls, continued on page 2, column 3.
The Post-Press, July 4, 1937. Amelia Earhart's voice heard, sending out SOS. Floating laboratory now. Above, the $80,000 flying laboratory, with which Amelia Earhart started out to circle the globe. After covering most of the distance, she came to grief Friday in the Pacific when fuel ran low in her plane. Below, route taken by Miss Earhart. Search press by air. C for missing plane. Navy airboat roars toward Howland Island from Honolulu. 2 U.S. warships join hunt. Bulletin, Honolulu, Territory of Hawaii, July 3rd, UP. Naval headquarters announced that a snow and sleet storm, almost unprecedented in the South Seas, today forced back to Honolulu a giant Navy seaplane, which left here last night for Howland Island to aid in the search for Amelia Earhart. San Francisco, July 3rd, UP. The calm radio voices of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, reported heard in Los Angeles calling from their lost plane in the South Pacific, spurred hope today that they were still alive and gave impetus to a far-flung search by sea and air. A powerful Navy seaplane roared from Honolulu toward Howland Island to aid the Coast Guard cutter Itasca in the hunt, which started yesterday, when the plane overshot Howland on an attempted round-world flight and dropped fuel either into the ocean or on some isolated island. 2 United States warships were speeding to Howland. 11 additional Navy planes were standing by at Pearl Harbor, ready to depart at a moment's notice. Miss Earhart's husband, George Putnam, maintaining a ceaseless vigil at Oakland Airport, Was not convinced, however, that the voices were those of either Miss Earhart or Noonan, her navigator. No generator. He also was not certain that the plane had actually sent out earlier and dash signals reportedly picked up by Coast Guard stations, by the British warship Achilles, and the freighter New Zealand. I would be tremendously cheered if these reports were true, he said, but the plane is obviously down somewhere, and being down, I am afraid its radio would be out of commission. To my knowledge, Miss Earhart did not have a hand generator. Continued on page 2, column 2.
The Sunday Star, July 4th, 1937. Lexington standing by with 54 planes to join hunt for Earhart ship. Awaits orders for trip of 4,400 miles. Snow thwarts rescue flight. Itasca carries on Hun alone as hopes fade. By the Associated Press, Honolulu, July 3rd. The Navy tonight made the powerful aircraft carrier Lexington and 54 fighting planes ready to reinforce the faltering hunt for Amelia Earhart, lost nearly 36 hours in the shark-infested mid-Pacific with her navigator, Fred J. Noonan, in her $80,000 plane. In the face of discouraging prospects for quick rescue of the famous globe-circling aviatrix, the Lexington was ordered to fuel to capacity and stand by at San Diego in preparation for a possible cruise to the Howland Island area. Officials said orders had not been issued yet for the actual departure time. Naval officials did not estimate how long the Lexington would require to reach Howland, 4,400 miles away, if it were ordered to make the trip. During a day of slowly ebbing hope, a long-range Navy plane left Honolulu on a 1,500-mile dash to the place in mid-Pacific where Amelia was believed forced down Friday by lack of gasoline. But it got caught in a snow, sleet, and lightning storm high above the ocean as it approached the equatorial region and was forced to turn back. Itasca hunts alone. The Coast Guard cutter Itasca carried on the search alone in the Howland region, where Miss Earhart and Noonan presumably came down, a few miles short of their goal. By mid-afternoon, the Itasca reported it had scanned 3,000 square miles of ocean without having sighted the plane, and with no word whatever from the missing flyers. Recurring reports of SOS calls being heard from the helpless Earhart plane buoyed hopes of relatives and friends, but some of the leaders in the search expressed increasing pessimism over the possibilities of success. Confusion and overlapping reports of distress calls made it difficult to sift them to definite information, but authorities were openly skeptical. One of these turned out to be radio signals from the Itasca itself. Although the weather in the vicinity of Howland Island was reported in no wise unusual, word of the high-altitude storm caused naval authorities here to dispatch 4 surface vessels along the route of the returning rescue plane to guide it to a safe landing, which it made at Pearl Harbor at 7:24 p.m., 12:54 a.m. Sunday, EST. It had been in the air 24 hours. Late tonight, naval officials at San Diego announced that the destroyers Southward and Chandler would leave at 5 a.m., 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, tomorrow to act as guard ships for the searching air patrols. Itasca combing area. The Itasca, which temporarily had abandoned the hunt and returned to Howland Island to serve as a base for larger operations, immediately began combing the area about Howland Island where Miss Earhart came down yesterday. Naval authorities considered the plight of their searching planes so precarious that they ordered 2 destroyers and 2 aircraft tenders to take up stations along its return route. The battleship Colorado, carrying 3 catapult planes, sailed at 1 p.m., 6:30 p.m. EST from Pearl Harbor for Howland Island to aid the Itasca, which reported it would be out of fuel by Monday morning. It thus appeared the search might lag from Monday morning until Tuesday night or Wednesday, when the Colorado is scheduled to reach the scene. The Colorado carried oil for the Itasca. May send another plane. Pending return of the naval plane, officers considered sending out another of its kind, but had reached no decision. Meanwhile, the Itasca reported no further radio signals had been heard. Temporary discontinuance of the Itasca's efforts would leave only the relatively slow Navy tug Swan available in the Howland area. The Swan was heading toward Howland Island after having stood by at the halfway point between the islet and Honolulu. Some search authorities reported receiving word that the British radio, see Earhart, page A5. President anxious over Miss Earhart. Chief executive keeps in close touch with Navy Department by telephone. By the Associated Press, Hyde Park, New York, July 3rd. President Roosevelt kept in close touch with the Navy Department today, seeking information on the fate of Amelia Earhart, world-girdling aviatrix forced down in the South Pacific. White House officials said he talked with the Naval Operations Office many times by telephone. They added that all information regarding naval assistance in the search would be given out in Washington. There was little indication here, however, that a large naval force would be sent out because of the great distance. Amelia Earhart planned hop as last aerial adventure was to have been final fling in spectacular stunt flying, she confided to friends before departure. Special dispatch to the Star. New York, July 3rd. Amelia Earhart's equatorial flight around the world, now terminated dramatically, if not tragically, in mid-Pacific, was to have been her last great aerial adventure, a final fling in the field of spectacular flying before she settled down for keeps to the more or less prosaic existence of participation in routine phases of aviation. She confided this to one or two friends, including the writer, just before she left Oakland, California, for Honolulu last March on her first attempt to girdle the globe by air. "I have a feeling that there is just about one more good flight left in my system," she said, "and I hope this trip around the world is it. Anyway, when I have finished this job, I mean to give up long-distance stunt flying." Miss Earhart hastened to add that this was by no means an announcement of her intended retirement from flying to rest on her laurels as the outstanding airwoman of the world. On the contrary, she said that she meant to continue flying in connection with her lecture tour and other work, and that one of the first things on her program she wanted to do after completing her world flight was to carry out an extensive flight research program at Purdue University, Lafayette, Indiana, the original purpose for which her Wasp-motored Lockheed Electra flying laboratory was purchased and equipped. "But the fact that you are through with long-distance air exploits when this flight is over is a darned good news story," Miss Earhart was reminded. "Why can't that be written as soon as you are safely on your way across the Pacific? All you'll have, see flight, page A5. Amelia's husband comforts wife of navigator amid gloom." By the Associated Press, Oakland, California, July 3rd. Two left-behind mates of the round-the-world flyers, lost in the vast Pacific, passed part of the long afternoon trying to bolster one another's sinking hopes as the hours brought no certain word from Amelia Earhart or her navigator, Frederick J. Noonan. George Palmer Putnam hurried up the steps of Mrs. Beatrice Noonan's home just as she was starting to the airport to look for him. He patted her on the shoulder and told her again and again, "Everything is going to be all right. I have a hunch they are sitting somewhere on a coral island and sending out their signals," said Putnam. "Fred's probably out sitting on a rock now catching their dinner with those fishing lines they had aboard. There'll be driftwood to make a fire. Maybe they could rig up a gasoline stove, if there is any gasoline left." Putnam's theory was that Miss Earhart probably pancaked the flying laboratory down near some bit of island and rigged up the plane's aerial to send the SOS messages amateurs reported hearing today. Putnam reminded Mrs. Noonan the flyers had plenty of food and water, tomato juice and concentrated food tablets to keep them alive for weeks. He said the plane could float for weeks if it struck the water undamaged. Once the tall Putnam stopped his pacing and said flatly, "It's this way, B. One of two things have happened. Either they were killed outright and that must come to all of us sooner or later, or they are alive and will be picked up."